G'day, mate. 40 here. We're going academic today. I just read a very compelling new book called The Star Chamber of Stanford on the Secret Trial and Invisible Persecution of a Stanford Law Fellow. The author is Rony Guldmann. Rony, where did you write this book?
Where did I write it? I wrote it in various places. Its very beginnings were actually during the time related, though that was still inchoate. But after my fate was sealed at Stanford, I was in Israel for a few years. I've connections there, and I was considering living there, and I certainly developed its foundations as well. And then the rest, since then, I was also working on the companion volumes, like Conservative Claims of Cultural Oppression, as I know, which is actually significantly longer than the published memoir, and I had to do that as well. So I think there were a number of years when I didn't work on the book at all. I was just working on the theoretical stuff. But once that was in good enough shape, I turned my attention fully to the book. I would say probably since maybe fall 2017, I was doing that exclusively from a writing point of view, and I just and that was done here in New York. I moved back to New York around 2013. So I guess I gave you both the where and the when.
Yeah, and I'm going to encourage you to look at your cam a little bit more.
Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, is it good now?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
So
Sure.
So
all right.
get the full
Well, I just
experience.
wanted to make sure I wasn't missing the microphone, but it is designed to catch my voice. So
yeah, and so tell me, why did you write the book?
Well, I think I'm going to give you an answer. I mean, we can probably conceptualize the answer on a number of levels. So let me start with one that's consistent with the introduction to the book. I start off by quoting that paragraph from Rousseau's Discourse on Arts and Sciences, the origin of intellectual life and intellectual achievement originates in our vices and not our virtues, and pride being foremost among those vices. And I think that's certainly true on some level, because at the time at Stanford, I was committed hell or high water to this research project, which I was hoping would open some doors to an academic career. For reasons I described throughout the memo, it didn't. But I think I was too proud to surrender to fate. So yes, all of the usual avenues for communicating my ideas, had been cut off. Obviously I could, post stuff on academia or SSRN or whatnot, but that's not going to get anyone's attention. So I realized that I would not surrender to fate. So how to proceed? Well, I write. This is the story of a term paper that came to life. The term paper that was first written for Stanford before it had to become about Stanford, and it had to become about Stanford because that was the only way of resuscitating my research agenda by tying me in some way to the prestige of that institution, which, I mean, I had to some extent just by virtue of having studied there and had the fellowship, but I would have to do so. I would have to take that to a different level in order to actually disseminate my ideas. So it was pride and necessity.
Tell me a little bit about your ancestors and your parents.
So yeah, it's a convoluted story, and I can't fill in all the gaps, even though I've asked about it. So I was born in Strasbourg, France, which is right there on the German border. Lots of wars have been fought over it, but my ethnic origins aren't French, strictly speaking. So my mother was born in Tunisia. And I think her ancestors had been there for a few hundred years. I imagine they got kicked out of Spain, like the other Jews there, around 1492 with the Inquisition. So that's the story on their end. My dad was also born in Strasbourg, but his father was from Bavaria, and how far his roots go back there, I'm not sure, but I've been given to understand that Guldmann actually has Dutch origins. So he might have emerged from or his lineage might have emerged from Holland at some point. I'm not sure. My grandmother on my dad's side, so she was born in Alexandria, Egypt, and later moved to France to marry my grandfather on my dad's side. Her origins, I'm not sure. I mean, I've heard some stories that she had lineage in the Russian Empire of the time. So she could be of Ashkenazi lineage, notwithstanding that she was born in Egypt. And so basically, my father studied, he got his PhD in urban planning in Israel. And after doing undergraduate in France, my mother's family left. They moved to France once Tunisia won independence from France. They lived in France for a few years and then moved to Israel. And that's where my mother grew up, and that's where they met because my dad was studying there. And then they moved back to France, and I was born. And when I was 4, we moved to the U.S. because my dad got a job at Ohio State.
And so you lived most of your childhood in what is that, Columbus, Ohio?
Columbus, Ohio. Yeah, it's a suburb, Worthington, Ohio, to be exact. It's just one of the northern suburbs of Columbus. Pretty middle America, not completely parochial. It's a big enough city. It's a university town, but yeah, pretty much middle America nonetheless.
Would it be fair to describe you as a rootless cosmopolitan?
I guess by necessity, cosmopolitanism has not been an ideal towards which I've aspired, but looking back at the course of events and all the places I've lived and different career routes I've pursued, it's kind of hard to argue against that conclusion, I guess.
So the easiest way to understand my work is to understand my lack of a relationship with my father and just ongoing rebellion against father figures. Just curious, right. What was your relationship like with your father?
Well, it has varied over time. It's quite good now. It's been poor at other times. Certainly, the events at Stanford complicated relations with everyone. Given the strangeness of the events related, I would certainly say that I have a rebellious streak. Now, whether that originated in some family dynamic or in some other way, I'm not certain, but certainly I can discern the roots of those tendencies already in high school, where I would run for student council and give anti-establishment speeches or write anti-establishment, criticizing school decisions on the parking lot in a sardonic kind of way in the school newspaper. So it was all trivial stuff, but looking back, you see that character is destiny.
Yeah, and just to round the bases, what was your relationship like with your mother?
That also has gone back and forth. She is she passed away a few years ago, but she was manic depressive, in a serious way, and what that meant varied from period to period. There were times, a long time when modern medicine was able to keep it under control and facilitate a decent life. But nevertheless, when someone is struggling with something like that, there are going to be all sorts of external repercussions. And likewise, with events of Stanford, that was also quite difficult to convey to her, though she did have some sympathy. When she saw some of my writing, she wasn't completely unsympathetic, but there was sort of this tendency, like, okay, fine, but it's fine you're doing this, but treat it as a hobby, move on to more serious things, and one who has read the book will understand that I could not treat it as a hobby. So that was a source of friction.
Here's a question out of left field, but I think it's also applicable. If you're applying for an academic job and they ask you, what are your pronouns? What would be your internal reaction to that sort of question?
Um, I, I would find that quite strange. Now, of course, that was at the time. The last time I applied for an academic job, that was I don't know, probably around 2010, and that was not in there yet. I do think, I guess, what is my opinion of the transgender movement? Well, I certainly don't discount that there may be something, authentic about it when somebody says, well, I'm physically male, but I have a female gender identity. I'm not sure what exactly that means. I'm not saying it's inauthentic. I am saying I don't think that we understand it very well. I'm saying that even people who are transgender don't really know how to articulate it well, because to kind of say that, people's basic worldview as divided between males and females, you know, I think we can add nuance to that, and show that maybe reality is more complicated than that clean bifurcation. But for the extreme of the transgender movement, will say, well, this basic foundational way of even thinking about the world is this massive social illusion. I don't think people are going to swallow that. And so when they ask, what are your uh, pronouns, on one hand, that's fine in the sense that if somebody did have atypical pronouns, I suppose you would want to know that. But I think it's also kind of resented in as much as the subtext of these apparently benign requests is that your whole basic understanding of the world is an illusion, and you're kind of a fool for having fallen into that. I don't think that's true, and I certainly don't think it's good politically, because that's people are just going to reject that.
Great. And one other question. Oh yeah, if you were applying for an academic position and they asked you to write a diversity statement, what would be your reaction to that, and what do you think you'd write?
It would be very artificial. There would be nothing that would come from my heart. If what we mean anything I could say authentically would be very banal, I think. Yeah, I mean, diversity is not a bad thing, but there are many different kinds of diversity, and it's not surely the only consideration. So it would just be banal like that. But from the heart, I never, it's not something that resonates with me so much. I understand that, of course, if you got a historically oppressed group, that group identity is going to be more inevitably salient to them. And so I know it's kind of facile just to say, just be colorblind. So I wouldn't want to urge that in a facile way. But on the other hand, I wouldn't want to discount it as an ideal altogether, and which the diversity movement certainly risks doing.
Okay, there are hundreds of law schools in the United States. What sets Stanford Law School apart?
Well, in a sense, and this is something that I address in the preface, um, anything that sets it apart in my experience, and I don't want to speak outside of that experience. So today, if somebody were to ask me, oh, I could go to Harvard or I could go to Stanford, what do you think? I would be in no position to say, well, Stanford has clinics ABC, and I think that's cutting edge and innovative. That may well be the case. It's probably the case, but that's not something I know. I can speak to personally. So I can only address that from the point of view of my experience as related in the memoir. And in connection with that, I would say that in terms of the underlying target of my critique, which are the cultural pathologies of academia, nothing sets it apart as far as I can tell. There is a common academic ethos which is going to pervade different institutions. The fact they are geographically separate is going to have minimal or no effect on that. So, from the point of view of my negative critique, I say, nothing sets it apart. Though it is set apart in my experience, given the nature of my allegations, and I try to frame that in a positive way, which is this is the place where my thesis came to life, where the higher truth of conservative claims of cultural oppression was articulated three-dimensionally and autobiographically, and certainly, notwithstanding the antagonism, you have to give credit to anyone who can help bring that about, which the memoir does.
How would you describe your politics? For example, I could describe my own as paleoconservative. How would you describe yours?
As far as if you were going, as I say in the book, if you were going to go down a checklist of issues, I would be, by and large on the liberal side. I have my worldview is, maybe it's not really scientific, but it's scientific. So, for example, I have a hard time believing that a 3-week-old fetus has any quality that's worthy of moral regard. If you had a more metaphysical worldview, you might see things differently. As far as economics, there I have really very little truck with conservatives. I mean, certainly, government regulation can go too far in certain instances. I'm not disputing that. I would say, for example, in France, where it's almost impossible to fire somebody without going to court and justifying it rigorously, that's not a good thing. But the idea that if we have some form of universal health care or universal health insurance, that somehow that is the the road to serfdom, or that we're going to lose the virtue of self-reliance, that I find kind of absurd. I know that I think probably paleoconservatives might share that sentiment as well. As civilization has developed, we have to do fewer things for ourselves. Yeah, it used to be, if your farmhouse is burning, you've got to put it out. There's no fire department. If somebody steals someone from you, very likely you're on your own, or your clan is on your own. So the whole process of modernity is actually relieving individuals of individual responsibilities for certain things, so they can turn their attention to other things. And I think something like guaranteed health care and some level of the welfare state generally is basically just a rational extension of that.
Mm-hmm. And would you attend a same-sex wedding?
Yeah.
And do you feel any internal revulsion towards same-sex marriage?
No, I mean, it's like, it's obviously, since, to the extent, if you're heterosexual, yeah, you may find the idea of homosexual sex, quite unappealing. But to me, that's unappealing in the same way that hard-boiled eggs are unappealing. Like, I don't like the taste of it or the thought of tasting it, but that is simply a subjective preference. So I'm not going to think about it. It's not really relevant. And so likewise, no, it's just something. It's just a matter of indifference to me, by and large. I don't let my subjective predilections transmute into any kind of moral judgment.
And what about, let's say you had a friend who you discovered had just a really strong internal revulsion towards same-sex marriage, couldn't even articulate a good argument against it, just had a strong internal revulsion against it, and on that basis would not attend one. What would your reaction to such a person be?
Well, I've had such a friend, and it was a long time ago, back in grad school at Indiana. He actually he wasn't necessarily didn't necessarily feel like that way at first, but he was kind of a bit of a lost soul as well. Been abused as a kid, and he was he was for a while considering moving into Judaism, but ultimately he turned to Orthodox Christianity out of his Greek church or Russian church or something like that. But they're fairly conservative, and and so he certainly voiced those kinds of sentiments. He was other forms of disgust as well. He was more pro-Israel than I was, and he had probably a certain revulsion towards Arabs or Muslims as well. And I certainly didn't approve of that. But on the other hand, I guess that is what separates me from the woke culture. That those attitudes are not so viscerally repugnant to me that I would not be able to handle this person or even be their friend necessarily. I see those as misguided and regrettable, but they're also kind of human in a certain way if you understand the full complexity of humanity. And people have always had mores, and holding certain things strongly has often led to a sort of corresponding revulsion to things outside of that. So I would say I'm not repelled by homosexuality, and I'm not repelled by repulsion by homosexuality either. Maybe if I was gay, that would probably be different. I understand that I would have a different perspective, but and maybe it's because I'm a little bit too aloof, the philosopher of the clouds. And so, okay, well, I disagree, but maybe I hold myself to a standard or live by a standard or am captured by a standard, which it would be unreasonable to ask of most people, for better or ill. That's how I would sort of describe my reflexes.
Got it. What is Stanford Law School's reputation among elite American legal scholars?
Say that again.
What is Stanford Law's reputation?
I think it's certainly in the very top. I would imagine the top 3 or 4. On U.S. News and World Report, it's usually ranked number 2 or 3, behind Yale or behind Yale and Stanford. Now that is kind of a crude measure, and certainly most legal scholars would reject that as amateurish. But and they have their own ideas about who's doing the most cutting edge research. That's going to vary from person to person. But Stanford is certainly very much up there. As I say in the book, it doesn't have the same level of pop culture recognition as Harvard, which is going to be in all sorts of movies. I went to Harvard Law School, or even Harvard generally. But in terms of its concrete reputation, I think it's right up there.
Okay. And what were your expectations going into? So you entered Stanford Law second year. You did your first year of law school at University of Texas. So
that's right.
What were your expectations for your presumably 2-year experience at Stanford Law?
Well, I didn't necessarily have expectations, but I had a goal. And the perverse thing is that I actually realized the initial goal, or the initial stage of my goal, very effectively. As I explained, I had a great time at Texas, learned a lot, but from the point of view of academic careers, Stanford and kindred places were optimal. So I went in there. I didn't really think about what to expect. I just thought, this is what I need to do. And then I actually did pull it off with a fellowship. Afterwards, things went awry, of course, as I relate. But it was, I would say certainly there was, in terms of the law school itself, putting aside my research and my ultimate ambitions, from the point of view of just experience, certainly Texas was better, in the sense that I was in the same cohort with everybody. Everybody was a first year, so I made friends. I had my group. By the time I arrived at Stanford, it was the second year. people already knew each other, and yeah, you could work your way in to a certain extent, but it wasn't like that same bonding experience of the first year where you're all there and new and you're all freaking out about your grades and the material. That 1L of law school is really a special experience, and so by comparison with that, it's not because it was Stanford, it's because of the fact that I transferred.
What was the genesis of your work on conservative victimology?
Well, I think it started, even though, as I described my views as overall liberal, I certainly had still had a visceral unease with it, because I do think that even though ultimately, if it comes down to policies, I'm going to be liberal. It's certainly the case that liberalism sort of exiles and excommunicates aspect of human nature that are, for better or ill, natural. And it's, some people supersede. I don't want to say supersede, because that implies a judgment, but I say, suspend those, to use a neutral term, more effectively than others, and they become liberals. But it's not necessarily reasonable to expect that of everyone, and certainly liberal, by their own principles, liberals are compelled to recognize that how people are differently situated for a variety of cultural and biological and accidental reasons, and to think that anybody who just had a clean intentions or a good heart could sort of snap their fingers or would snap their fingers to adopt the liberal worldview, that was kind of facile to me, and at first that was just sort of a very visceral sense, and I pursued the project in order to articulate it, and it was so visceral, in fact, that even a year into the fellowship, as I described, I'd only just begun succeeding in articulating it.
What are the skills that make for a good lawyer?
Well, certainly, this is underrated, but certainly a tolerance for tedium, yeah, and to sort of just be able to get this sense that, oh, I just finished a task. I wrote a letter to the judge complaining that the other side hasn't produced their discovery, and got that done, check mark. And that's not necessarily so interesting or intellectually challenging, but that's a lot of the work. And so you have to keep yourself in a mindset where you can derive some meaning. So that's sort of the underrated quality. I'd say at the other end, certainly the ability to make arguments, to persuade, and even to an extent to manipulate arguments, but without insulting the judge's intelligence. Those are valuable skills too.
Why don't you give me a 5-minute summary of your book, preferably without repeating points that we've already covered?
That is something I would have a very hard time doing, even though obviously I understand that listeners want to hear it. And the problem is this, and hopefully this will give them, some kind of indication. Okay, so what I can say generally, yeah, it is sort of a fall from grace. I was able to create certain high hopes among the faculty there, but owing to my conflicts, I would say not with them personally as individuals, though it led to that too, but with the norms of academia, that relationship progressively soured, though in very subtle ways that went unacknowledged at the time. And that eventually led to the conflagration, which I describe as my gaslighting. And the problem with any kind of summaries, sort of on the one hand, I can say, well, it's a lot of it is a critique of certain the intellectual norms of academia, which are in fact quite intellectually stifling and reflect a certain conservatism by the liberal elites, which is ultimately hypocritical given the demands that they, impose on society. So, if I were to say that, some people might find that it somewhat interesting. Other people might find it banal. They say, well, yeah, we know there's a lot that's irrational about academia. Are you really telling us anything new? So if I put it that way, I'm not going to get that much reaction. Now, the other pole of what the memoir is about is the gaslighting, and as I, you said it sounds kind of incredible to you, because I'm saying that there was a form of communication, but solely through ambiguation and intimation and illusion, that we had a form of communication that it was ultimately subterranean and had to be decoded against this background, which all parties understood and none knew. If I put it that way, it's going to sound either really weird, or you're not going to, probably won't know what I'm talking about. If I say that the school website itself embodied a message which was at the epicenter of this whole thing. Well, that's, if I just put it that way, it's going to sound crazy. So, but the only way to put those two aspects of it together and realize that the book is neither banal nor crazy is to read it. And so, of course, I'm asking, when I ask people to read it, I am asking them to undertake a certain leap of faith, and maybe this will help persuade them to do that. But it is a leap of faith,
Yeah, and from my own experience, I've lived my life as a dissident and a heretic who's been thrown out of almost every community I've ever joined.
Yeah, I read about that.
And it is no fun. It's absolutely no fun whatsoever. And
yeah,
I can't overstate the toll of having people around you think you're crazy. That just took an enormous toll on me. That
right.
practically drove me crazy. The more other people regarded me as crazy. I'm just curious about your experience.
Well, I totally agree with that. And in fact, if we talk about maybe let me add an addendum to what I earlier said about why I wrote the book. In a sense, because the book is it is a shield against that charge. Okay, you could say that, but I can say read the book. And if they say you're crazy, I can say, why exactly don't you accept argument A, B, C, and D? And I had one of my editors who was really great, but she was skeptical of the facially outlandish contentions. But then when I confronted her with specific arguments, it's not like she could refute them, but she just said, oh well, you have the ability to argue that the moon is made of green cheese. So yeah, you can make these arguments and I can't refute them, but I still don't believe you, which is fine. That I can deal. At least now I have a shield that I can say, look, do you really think a crazy person could write this on any conventional definition of crazy, a non-metaphorical definition of crazy? I always wanted to say, obviously not. And the book is, I hope, what establishes it.
Now, I can't overstate my desire to sit at the cool kids table. Like, I love the cool kids. I love the successful. I mean, I love that stuff. I really, 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 really want to belong to the cool kids. There's only one thing in the world that I want more, and that is to pursue what I think is true and to say what I think is true.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious, do you also have a significant, through the, nose against the glass, kind of looking in at the cool kids table desire, or has that become muted in you?
Look, in a sense, I certainly I have those thoughts sometimes, because I think, okay, I've got a good paying job, I'm fine. I'm not working at Starbucks. I'm not, picking up the garbage, but I certainly see that, a lot of former law students my age, or even significantly younger, certainly from Stanford, are certainly further ahead in their careers than I am. They're they're partners at firms as opposed to a senior associate. They're partners at firms where they're really making hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars each year. I look back, I say, why am I not there? I have the same degree. I had the right grades. I can, if we're in court and they write a motion to dismiss, I can defeat them. So I know I can stand toe to toe to them. So, but why am I not sitting at the cool kids table? But I try to say, in the end, just you got to embrace your fate. You try to, walk those two worlds between, establishing a palatable place in society, but also pursuing your heart's passion, which is the book. And I've tried to effect a compromise between those two as best I could, because I didn't really have a choice in the matter.
Now, I'm thinking off the top of my head. So for the normie who's watching this and thinking, okay, is there a larger point here other than this individual's guy's, fight for his reputation? One way that I would summarize the larger point is that the Western world is largely run by a liberal left consensus, and this liberal left consensus is as flawed and deserving of critique as any other attempt at a worldview. That would be one way I would summarize your scholarship. Is that fair?
Yeah, it certainly does, because at the end of the day, even if it's more true than other worldviews, it certainly doesn't have a monopoly on truth. And given its prestige, and given the subtlety of its prejudices, because there is a lot of truth there too, but it's also false in, let's say, in certain subtle ways, like when I discussed transgenderism, just as one example. It certainly merits critiques, and I kind of always felt like in law school you got lots of people who are like they're writing articles defending certain international human rights norms, right to abortion, various demands for various kinds of equality, and I always felt, it's not that I opposed that necessarily, but I felt that they were reaching for the low hanging fruit. The higher hanging fruit is the elites, the people who have the cultural power, the might of Stanford, as I describe it. That always had a greater allure to me. That was a certain kind of hubris, perhaps, and it led to the tumult I describe. But I have, again, maybe it comes back to this primordial rebelliousness. I can say it doesn't matter, even if you have 75% of the truth or whatnot. I'm not going to rest on my laurels.
Let's step outside and step away for a minute from your personal story. What were the key intellectual breakthrough points in your journey of scholarship of conservative victimology, and why is it even important to have a scholarship of conservative victimology?
Well, the question is there some sort of underlying inequality between socially instituted inequality between liberals and conservatives, which the liberals won't acknowledge, and that no one can really articulate very, very effectively on either side of the spectrum. And I felt that people sometimes have very flawed articulations of true things. Certainly that was the case with me with the gaslighting. The articulation has become more refined over the years. Initially it was certainly very flawed, but I still believed it was true. And likewise, this resentment towards liberalism, even though it may lead to a lot of stupid statements and a lot of cheap shots as well, there is an underlying inequality in the sense that you have certain default human impulses, in part religious, but also related to, the ego and pure animal self-affirmation, which you will find, among all human beings. But the elites have the privilege of sublimating that aspect of human nature so as to appear more civilized. And from that facially more civilized vantage point, they have then sort of the further privilege of, inveighing against everybody else, not realizing that if you take their concern for equality to its logical conclusion, their very ability to critique inequality is a product of a different kind of inequality. Namely, they can channel their traditionalism, their authoritarianism into these academic norms, which nobody on the outside, is going to pay that much attention to. And so there is this sense that they're getting away with something. And so, given my adversarial attitude, that's what I hope to experience, to articulate, both theoretically and in life.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
And you haven't finished, and you haven't published your book yet, even though drafts of it are available on your website, academia.edu. What do you need to do? What do you need to accomplish? What do you need to make concrete to put this book into final form?
Well, actually, I was starting to reread Conservative Claims of Cultural Oppression. I think, I would probably, if I were to go through it a few times, I would find, I would probably find some better word choices, some better locutions. But as far as the thesis itself, I think it's very close to publishable. Whether anybody would ever actually publish it, I don't know. I mean, certainly the length is in and of itself would be an obstacle, no matter who I was or what I was saying, But given that I'm essentially no one and saying something which is adversarial to the dominant dispensation, the length is one more huge problem. So it would be nice if somebody from some kind of press that would be willing to take a chance, was drawn to it through the memoir, right? The memoir is eye-catching. To whatever, certainly much more so than the theoretical work. So that was my ideal hope. Yeah, that the memoir could facilitate the publication of the academic stuff. Whether that's going to happen, I don't know. But I'm certainly, what I can't say, I'm not even really thinking about it, just because I'm so exhausted now from the whole thing. It's only been since December, I put the finishing touches on the memoir, and since then I was working on marketing and learning about self-publication and so forth. So I'm just too exhausted. I hope something good will happen, but yeah. I'm too tired to actively pursue it right now. I've got to live life in other ways.
Yeah, and what were the most important pieces of feedback that you got on your memoir prior to your publishing it?
Well, they were quite they were quite varied. There were certainly some. It's kind of like much else. I'd say it's like schizophrenic in the sense of going from one extreme to the next. So, for example, I sent it out to agents. Almost no one took an interest, which I think is pretty standard these days if you're not very famous or have a social media presence, from what I'm told. One had some interest in it. They read it. They obviously saw something there, but they ultimately decided it was too academic. So, when something like that happens, they go, well, okay, so I've got to create my own imprint. I've got no choice. You feel kind of like a loser. But when I had the penultimate version of the draft, I just sent it to a proofreader, and this proofreader, even though he proofread me, he was also an editor who had worked for 25 years with big presses, big academic presses too. When he read it, he responded, "This is you're the most intelligent writer, maybe with the strongest command of the English language. that I've ever worked with. So then you, of course, you feel great. And so it's always been these extremes between like people thinking this is sui generis originality, and others thinking you're wasting your life, and this is nonsense, and and that's still going on. I sent it out for like various reviews. I got a lot of 5-star reviews, but there was like a 3-star review too, where she saw essentially nothing of value in it, just found it ponderous and repetitive and whatnot. So it goes back and forth. But I mean, assuming and likewise as to the specific gaslighting contentions, I've had intelligent people who were readily persuaded of my claims. I've had intelligent people who are completely met intelligent people who are completely dismissive of my claims, and all sorts of people in between those. And so they're sort of you go back and forth. Am I crazy or am I not? Am I saying anything original or am I not? So I assume that experience is some version of that experience is pretty common for most artist types.
Yeah. Now, let's talk about some of the lead characters. And the number one character in the book, from my understanding, is Barbara Fried. So who is Barbara Fried?
Well, she was one of the 2 professors in one of the classes I took my last year at Stanford. And she clearly liked my work, and she was the one who offered the fellowship. So that's why, she is, in a sense, the main character, and also because I have the most email communications from her. So, and this is something that I try to emphasize, I'm not attacking anyone personally. No, I'm not. They're all, nice people who are committed to their chosen profession. No question of that. But I am critiquing the norms of that profession as they were embodied in these people. So so I sort of do seize upon her as kind of a paradigm case of certain academic pathologies. Not hard to do, because you wouldn't be successful if you didn't have those pathologies to one degree or another. And so I have certain critiques of her worldview, but I think on the other side, I also acknowledge certain of her virtues, namely that she kind of, from words that she said, said she has a certain prophetic prescience. So I think she had an intuitive sense that this conflict was there, and was, and Joe as well. They had a certain intuitive sense that there was a conflict, and they thought it could be managed, and it couldn't be. But I think they, notwithstanding how things turned out, I think that both she and Joe saw a certain potential in me, which a lot of others didn't, and I'm grateful for that. Though that potential could not unfold according to the rules which they had prescribed, and hence the conflict.
Now, how do you think, in a safe space, Barbara Fried would talk about her experience with you? How would she describe it?
Well, look, people move on with their lives. So, when, Josh Cohn responding, he had a good enough opinion of me, but I left no, lasting impression. That's perfectly fine with me, because people move on with their lives, and there's absolutely no reason why they, this many years later, would really have any strong feelings about me one way or the other. Maybe whether they'll have strong feelings about the publication of the book is something else. I don't know. But yeah, I wouldn't expect her or anyone else. I would expect me to be very important to them, to any of them, because they have the right to move on with their lives. But of course, I have the right not to move on with my life. Also, which describes why I have been clinging to this experience and seeking to articulate it for so many years.
Yeah, but I think there's more we can do more with her. Let's just focus on her, because she's the paradigmatic. Okay. She's like the paradigmatic both instigator and crusher of your dream.
Right.
Is that fair?
Yeah, yeah, okay, yeah, but I do describe things in that manner, but I also highlight the other story that I can understand. Like she, from her perspective, as the person who sort of went out on a limb to give me this fellowship and has certain professional aspirations. My conduct was highly delinquent. So yeah, so I try to keep that tension in view. Um, as you can tell from the book, there wasn't really, beyond a certain point, there wasn't really that much personal interaction other than through email. So
But she got you a fellowship. I would assume that's not a trivial get. She seemed to have substantial hopes and dreams for your career.
That's right, and I document that. Yeah, yeah, she did,
so
and I frustrated those.
Yeah,
I agree.
You frustrated those, and so I would imagine that she experienced you as betraying her faith in you.
Yeah, yes, I believe that, and I think I use those very words. And is that true or is that not true? Well, that's where
it's
time to become
subjective.
philosophical.
Of course, from her perspective, I could understand why she would experience it as betrayal.
Yeah.
Or betrayal is a subjective feeling that other people aren't doing as you expected.
Yeah.
It's just a hyperbolic expression. Do you think she learned anything? Like, do you think she changed as a result of the great disappointment with Rony Guldmann?
I really hesitate to speculate about something where I don't even have a modicum of circumstantial evidence. But with that caveat, again, I felt that there was a strong connection at certainly, at the beginning. It wasn't just that, she thought well of me, but I felt that, she also had a sense of the potential for my project, that maybe she understood certain of its layers or felt certain of its layers even better than I had. So certainly, given that I had that connection initially, I would like to think that she, revolved in a certain way as a part of the experience. But it was not an experience of the same, even if you accept, if you accept what my claims as true, then certainly the experience was more consequential for my antagonists than they would acknowledge, or would be the case if my underlying claims were false. But even assuming the truth of everything, I don't think that the whole thing would have as pronounced an effect on them as it had on me, because they're, at the end of the day, notwithstanding frustrations of all kinds, they are and were settled in life in a pretty nice position. So any kind of conflict or frustration or disappointment, I don't think it's going to affect them as much as it has me, who was and still does operate from an inferior power position.
So, do you think it's possible that she might go weeks without thinking about the Rony Guldmann experience?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's possible. I don't think she would go years without thinking of it.
No, but weeks. Yeah.
Yeah, she could go weeks without thinking about it. Yeah, that would surprise me.
So one critique, which you do answer in your book, but I just want to articulate it, is that every group has a code and every group has a language, and you simply refuse to abide by the code and the language of this group. And so to succeed with any group, you need to abide by codes and certain forms of language. So if you had phrased your scholarship, and this is from your book, in these terms. Professor X has recently introduced a fascinating new framework through which to address problem A in an effort to replace the approach that has been most famously defended by Professor Y, arguing that this not only provides fresh, multidisciplinary insight into problem A, but also sheds a new and intriguing light on problem B, which Professor Z first brought to our attention in his rigorously argued and thoroughly researched book C. But Professor Z's book C, in fact, anticipated and raised serious reservations about the approach now being defended by Professor X in response to Professor Y. This article argues that while Professor Z's reservations have substantial merit, the force of those concerns is attenuated to the extent that we plausibly interpret Professor X as supplementing rather than supplanting the analysis of Professor Y. Thus conceived, the questions introduced by Professor X promise not only to enrich our understanding of problem A, but also to open up new avenues of interdisciplinary research into problem B that build on those painstakingly developed by Professor Z, because problem B, properly understood, is just another facet of problem A. So why didn't you do this?
It would have been inauthentic. Now people who are differently constituted might sort of understand what I'm saying, but say, hey, come on, grow up. The world is the world. Things are imperfect. Institutions are imperfect, but we've got to adapt, move on your career. That is the proper attitude of the elite, but I'm just not that kind of person, as I acknowledge. I had a certain impulse which was growing in me on I felt in different ways on different levels for quite some time, which is why I related what happened at Stanford to my earlier days at Indiana in the PhD program there. This certain adversarial attitude, which I recognize had always been there. So, it is what it is. What can you say? And normally that kind of recalcitrance is going to get you into trouble. But, I had and have the hubris that, notwithstanding that, I can somehow prevail. And the memoir and its publication is my attempt to do so. What will happen is anybody's guess, as I stated.
But why didn't you engage with previous perspectives on conservative victimology, simply using the template that you describe, and then simply take it in the directions you want to go, but essentially following the template? And I'll give you an example from my own life. So 2 days before I was due to graduate from my Alexander Technique training school, my teachers were alerted to a blog post I'd made where I'd criticized one particular approach to the Alexander Technique, and I used a kind of dismissive, careless language that they took great offense to. And this blog post essentially ended my wider career in the Alexander Technique community. I will never be able to join AMSAT, the American Society of Alexander Technique Teachers. From that one blog post, I fell out ineluctably with all of my professors. There was just no going back. And from that experience, I went home and I rephrased that blog post so that it didn't cause offense. Now, I'd already done permanent damage, but if I'd simply taken the care to phrase things in a way that would be less likely to give offense, I could have still communicated all the ideas that I wanted to communicate. So why didn't you subordinate yourself to this form and still then use the form to travel in the directions you want to travel to?
So that comparison suggests that these sort of subtle academic norms, which I describe as the rationalization of intellectual life, is comparable to a certain kind of tact, of social finesse, which might be more or less appealing to different people, but which everybody can adapt to, and probably should quite a bit of the time. But I guess I would reject the underlying comparison, because I think that these norms, which masquerade as a kind of intellectual seriousness and being professional and knowledgeable and attuned to the field, I think it's a greater sacrifice than the one you described in your post hoc revision. I think it's a stifling form of asceticism, which is imposed on you. So I have no problem making trivial sacrifices. I've no impulse to reject social norms as such. So even though I did certainly describe a certain recalcitrance in my in my youth, I'm happy to conform where I can, where the sacrifice is tolerable. But I don't think it is when it comes to our overall paradigm of the life of mind. And I think one thing, throughout my various quotes from Bordeaux and Emerson and Polanyi, it's all there to show that this paragraph that you have described, it is really underpinned by a certain way of looking at the mind and looking at the world. And so, accordingly, the sacrifice would have been too substantial to bear.
Now, have there been conservative works of victimology that you could have done commentary on?
Well, as I say, no one thinks in a vacuum, and I'm certainly not saying that, yeah, the right approach is just to, think for yourself by just ignoring everybody else and come up with your own views. I think that's quite simplistic. Inevitably we need to be stimulated by the outer world. And if you were to look not only in the memoir but also at conservative claims of cultural oppression, you will see that it cites other thinkers quite a bit, and some of what they've said have been quite crucial to my own formulations. So I'm certainly in favor of a certain kind of interaction with your broader intellectual milieu and intellectual culture. But what is the form of that interaction? And the form of my interaction with it was utterly chaotic, in the sense that, well, I'm reading this, and oh yeah, he's saying something that could be useful and may help me articulate what I say. I read it, I take some notes, I move on, I look at something else, same thing. So that's not how it's usually done. Usually you have a field, and you can list the clear problems, and what people have made important contributions to addressing these various problems. And so that's how it normally goes. Normally it's quite structured, and not that there's no room for individual thought or individual creativity at all, but as I said, there's a certain sublimated asceticism, so it really is quite regimented. And I temperamentally went in the opposite direction, which created a lot of chaos, both on paper and, as I describe in the memoir, in the world itself. But at the end of the day, is it all redeemed somehow? Well, it certainly wasn't, redeemed in an academic career. That's clear, and it could not have been, despite my early hopes. But will it now be redeemed through the dissemination of this memoir and whatever else that leads to? We will see, as I said.
Now, my question was, are there major works on conservative cultural oppression that you could build on? And I mean, Jenna Goldberg, for all these talents, liberal fascism is not a major work. It's
Yeah.
and Victor Davis Hanson's columns, for National
Right.
Review, are not major works. So, are there major scholarly
Yeah.
works on conservative victimology that
Well,
you
I
could
would
build on?
say the single book that has most influenced the theory of conservative claims of cultural oppression is actually not necessarily by a conservative. Not that I would call him a leftist either. I don't know if you're familiar with Charles Taylor,
Hmm.
famous Canadian philosopher,
Yeah.
and his book, A Secular Age, has been really instrumental not as itself an articulation of conservative claims of cultural oppression, uh, but as a framework through which to understand them, because he is writing from a nonpartisan, non-ideological perspective to argue that this sort of left liberal way of understanding modernity and enlightenment and progress as fundamentally the subtraction of these old limitations and prejudices and mores is fundamentally mistaken. Because if you want to understand the drives of modernity, you have to understand how they originated out of certain religious impulses and other social impulses that later adopted a secular sheen and lost their religious rationalizations, but are ultimately spiritual in some meaningful sense. And once you see that, you can understand conservatives as resisting that whole tendency, and you understand. And so I think they have this. I think conservatives have an intuitive, whether they can articulate it theoretically or not. I think a lot of them have a very intuitive sense that there's something wrong with this liberal Enlightenment paradigm, and that's a visceral sense where they can't articulate well, and before which liberals are necessarily incredulous because they have this Enlightenment view. But what I try to do is to get people to take conservative claims of cultural oppression seriously. I can say, okay, Jonah Goldberg, Victor Nils Hansen, and all these other conservative claimants of cultural oppression, you have this impulse just to dismiss them. But what happens when I start taking what they say, things which you would dismiss as ridiculous, but I begin to explain their significance within this theory that derives from Charles Taylor and a secular age. At that time, you will see that these things which you are prone to dismiss have a deeper layer of meaning. So, if I just stick to conservatives, I'm not going to persuade liberal academics. But if I show that even these figures of which are normally contemptible harbor a deeper layer of meaning, which is articulated through this theory, that carries some value.
Now, I love it that Professor Joe Bankman, I believe, he was all in support of your project on claims of conservative oppression, so long as you only meant it ironically.
That's my sense. He did not put it in those terms, so there's some interpretation there. But but I certainly gave some indications that was my view, and it's the only that explains why he could be so enthusiastic, while at the same time evidencing this contempt for conservatism. There's no other way to square that circle, and that was my view to a certain extent as well, and that that irony probably continues as well on some level. Just this kind of perverse, impish contrarianism.
Yeah, I live in Los Angeles, and so when I get outside of Orthodox Judaism, most people are on the left, and I'm very much on the right. And for me to have harmonious social relations with people, particularly in a workplace, I have to have an attitude of ironic detachment and finding everything funny, because people, normies, find it unfathomable that I'd support Donald Trump. But as long as I essentially frame it in terms of it's funny, then they're able to deal with it.
Yeah.
And I've noticed a lot of other people kind of walking that same dance, that they're at a dinner party where everyone's trashing Trump and they kind of join in, but they do it, ironically.
Right. Well, you have the left and right, they intermesh in, strange ways these days. You have YouTubers who are kind of, they present themselves as liberals, but liberals who are honest enough to recognize the truth in what conservatives are are saying. So yeah, I mean, I've had this impish desire to maybe throw people off a bit, you know, as to where I stand, and you know, part of that is impishness. Part of that is maybe I'm not just completely certain where I stand either.
Yeah. And who is, I believe, Larry Kramer? What role does he play in your story?
Well, you know, he doesn't have you know, even though I believe he was involved in the gaslighting, he doesn't play a huge role. He was a um, along with Joe Bankman, he was one of the two instructors in the legal theory class. You know, he thought well of me. He was, you know, he backed the fellowship, and so forth, as I described it. He wasn't, you know, as involved as Joe and Barbara during the workshop. It was actually Joe who was my mentor and actually read, you know, most of my work. He's not in academia anymore. You know, last I yeah, he left, I think, a few years after I left. I think he became the chair president of the Hewlett Foundation,
Yes.
charitable
Yes.
foundation. So you know, I'm sure he's doing something important right now, whatever it is. Um, but you know, he's one more data point. He's not the driver. My sense is that it was probably Joe and Barbara who formed the the diagnosis of what was going on, whatever that was exactly. And I would imagine that Larry, because he knew that they knew me better, probably just deferred to their understanding of things, whatever that was.
And I believe in your story, the first law professor who had an intense negative visceral reaction towards you was Bob Weisberg. So talk to me about him and why you think he developed this like visceral reaction against you.
Oh, but that was, you know, I don't think he had, prior to that. I had no problem with him, and he had no problem with me. I'm talking about one specific evidence, and that's because, you know, I believe, on the basis of all the factors that I lay out in the memo, that he had been led to believe that I had falsified the works in progress, that I wasn't doing anything. So solely because he had been led to form that belief, that he reacted that way. You know, prior to that, there was no issue. It was a response to uh, particular circumstances and a particular way of understanding those circumstances.
Yeah, and you point this out in the book, but I've also experienced this in my own life. You can go a long way in life by giving the impression to your social superiors that you're looking up to them and taking cues from them, but you know,
Right.
eventually they find out that you've been taking them for a ride and they react really
Yeah.
badly.
Yeah. That is certainly not a wholly inaccurate way of describing things, you know. And I guess I had sort of uh, ends justified the means, a certain ideological zealotry uh, that allowed me to do that, to give off those false cues, which I fully acknowledge. I think I said I would deceive them and deceive myself along the way as necessary, precisely to maintain the facade you're describing. But you know, if you take the left to its logical conclusion, then it's quite easy to justify that. You say, yeah, they have these norms, and obviously you should be honest with them and straightforward. And I would just say, well, yeah, it's easy for you to embrace those norms, given that you're embracing them from the superior power position. I, in an inferior power position, to achieve what I want, have no choice but to flout them in some manner or another. And so, once again, there you see how I'm taking the logic of the left and inverting them against an institution which is commonly thought of as left.
I remember I was writing a book on Hollywood movie producers, and I started making some critical comments about Bob Ovitz, I think, who was, you know, a very powerful person in Hollywood at the time. And I remember these like various producers were just like irate that I, a complete outsider, would dare to say negative things about Ovitz, because I wasn't following the code. I mean, I got this a lot in my blogging and writing life.
Right.
People kept telling me, "You're not following the code. You're breaking the code, bro."
Right.
And it seems like you experienced something similar.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, maybe my my book will incur the kind of righteous contempt that you're describing. I don't know, their heart of hearts. If it did, they certainly wouldn't acknowledge it, because in academia, the ultimate insult is just I will is just to ignore somebody. It's like, I'm not even going to say anything negative about you because you're too unimportant even for that. So that being the ultimate insult in academia, my expectation is a whole lot of silence, regardless of what they're actually thinking. If they're thinking anything, again, I don't want to be presumptuous. It's possible that they won't care at all, but you are correct that when you are disturbing an established power hierarchy, it's certainly not unreasonable to expect that kind of blowback.
Yeah, I've had a lot of teachers, professors, and mentors say, I've never had anyone challenge me as much as you do, but the people that my professors would end up sponsoring and easing into really good jobs were never the people who were challenging them. It was always the people who didn't create waves for them and were just essentially adoring.
Yeah, sure. Well, I do think that academia sort of selects for a certain kind of obsequiousness. Now, I'm not saying there's no meritocracy either. There is. I mean, you certainly have to, as I say at various points, what do you need? You need to succeed in academia. Identify four things. So you certainly need some brains. You need some hard work. You need luck, and you need that obsequiousness we're discussing. Those are the four things. You really need all four.
Yeah, when I was at UCLA, I was quite friendly with a professor of musicology who's now dead. But one of his hobbies was setting up elite UCLA athletes with sex work with gay people in Hollywood. But no one ever wanted to talk about that. Like there are all these fulsome tributes to this guy who was quite a successful pimp, but no one wants to talk about that. It's just great musicologist.
Right. Oh yeah. I mean, there's certainly a shady underside to every institution. Though in my case, the shady underside is ultimately these cultural pathologies. So there's only so much they can say against me, given that ostensibly I'm just continuing the project that I began under their auspices. And that's something I try to highlight. That at the end of the day, even though you may see all this as a betrayal, I do not, precisely because the memoir and everything that has happened, I see as a logical outgrowth of what the project was. So I think, and I give them credit for discerning the potential from the outset. So I don't think, I obviously I was not going to take their advice when it came to a lot of things with respect to anything that would derail me from my project. But I think they were nevertheless instrumental, first of all, in just identifying the potential of the project, and Barbara in discerning certain structural tendencies which would unfold over the fellowship, and lastly, also the gaslighting itself, whose philosophical meaning I seek to unearth. So I'm trying to promote a nuanced view where I rejected certain aspects of what they had to offer, but I don't think they were inconsequential either.
Yeah, it took me about 15 years to finish my conversion to Orthodox Judaism because I kept getting kicked out because I'd blog about, powerful rabbis who, were sexually abusing people.
I just read that on your article. I think just posted just yesterday or very recently, right?
Yeah, that didn't endear me. And so after like one blog post where I wrote about this very influential, powerful rabbi in town who would, insist that the women this one particular woman I knew, that she must urinate on him, and he was her sponsoring rabbi. And so my sponsoring rabbi, biked over to my home, was so concerned about my well-being and said, sometimes you have to think strategically. And I think you got a lot of the same advice, to a normie, it's inconceivable that you're not thinking strategically here. I mean, most people can't conceive of that because most people I know who are my peers who are successful are careerists. They essentially put career success above every other value. And
they project their own vices onto you.
Yeah. And you did not choose to put career success above every other value.
Right. Well, I look at these, responses to my Facebook ads, and I don't know if people are responding just to the ad themselves or if they've gone onto the website. I got this, what was it? Very vulgar response. It was like, way to toot your own horn. Oh, wait, horn comes out of your mouth and not your ass. Something very vulgar like that. And they're thinking, obviously.
Was that from Barbara?
What's that?
Was that from Barbara?
No, this is just a random person on Facebook.
Yeah,
maybe Barbara would think the same thing. I don't know, but this was just from a random person on Facebook. And it's like, real. If my goal was some sort of vapid self-flattery, self-aggrandizement, would I have spent years of my life in this ascetic state of putting all these books together? There would certainly be an easier way to toot your own horn if that's what you're trying to do ultimately.
Right. The only reason that you talk about your experience and the only reason that you expect anyone else to have any interest in your experience and your resentments is purely as part of a structural laying out of a thesis of conservative victimology.
Right.
It has absolutely nothing to do with you and your experience, except to the extent that it is one layer in this larger thesis on conservative victimology. You're not important. You are laying out reactions to you that are only important not because they have anything to do with you, but only to the extent that they reveal larger issues.
That's sort of the thing. That's something I say. I think a number of points, certainly in the memorandum of law. This is not really about me. I mean, it's about me insofar as I'm interacting with these other forces, and likewise for other people, it's not them, except insofar as they're interacting with other forces. Yeah, so there is certainly a lot of people fail to appreciate the kind of the idealistic elements. Though I found it strange that even among some reviewers who did appreciate the idealistic aspirations, they still wrote about the book in a manner which I thought was a little bit too serious, because there's also, I would hope, and you said the book was hilarious.
Yes, I was laughing the whole time through.
Too.
Yeah,
I'm just having fun making fun of human beings, myself and others as well, and so I don't think that I am as serious a person as some people seem to be gathering from the book, even favorable reviewers.
Yeah. I mean, I someone just sent me an email right before the show that's like, oh, I don't want to read his memoir. I'm going to get depressed. So someone on the right. And I read back, it's not the least depressing. It's just the most hilarious book I've read this year. I mean, I was just doubled up in laughter all the way through. So,
yeah. I'm a lot of it, I'm trying to entertain.
Yeah.
The whole thing was Nussbaum, was this trivial anecdote.
Yeah.
I was just trying to entertain readers. That's all. I think she understood. So that is part of it, saying, listen, you've got these we're different people and they're in this situation and look what happened. Isn't it is it a comedy of errors? I guess it kind of is, but with a philosophical upshot. So that's something I want to like. No matter what I do, and that's why I'm very grateful for what you've done, because if I just go out there, I put out the blurb on the back cover. I can put some of the reviews, nice reviews I've gotten. I can put the frequently asked questions on the website. But it's so easy for people to get the completely wrong idea about the book.
Yeah, and if people are curious, I've reached out to every single person who's mentioned in this book. I've sent off 30 plus emails to every character in this book, inviting their comment on the book. I've frequently taken the time to excerpt from the book what you've written about other people. So one person who's responded is Joshua Cohen. So he's
I saw that.
Political science professor and a philosopher, and he also teaches in the law school. What role did Joshua Cohen play in your story?
He didn't play a huge role, in a sense, to the extent I use him. It's simply just to illustrate how my own I think he noted that I was perhaps thoughtful but ponderous, not an unfair characterization necessarily, and I use him to show how sort of my own ponderousness, which on another level what it just meant was commitment to the project, led to a conflict. So I sort of use him as a foil, because he's clean cut academic, studied with John Rawls, renowned theorist of liberalism. So I play with him a little bit. I use him as a foil, but his characterizations, as far as they go, are not inaccurate, as I stated in my response. I don't think that he was necessarily involved that much in the gaslighting, though I strongly suspect that he was at the very least aware of it. Of course, that's something he's necessarily going to deny. But at any rate, I don't think he was deeply involved in it. But he's just part of the cast, floating cast of characters that I came into interactions with, and I tried to learn what I could philosophically from each one as best I could.
Yeah, and I mean, Josh seems to be a sterling exemplar of how to operate in academia. Right?
Yeah,
he got a mentor. He plays by the rules of the game. He shows how to succeed in academia. Right?
For sure.
Is that fair?
For sure. I mean, anyone who becomes a professor at Stanford, presumably, would know that, unless you had some sort of, 17-year-old, math prodigy, genius who was solving all these old problems for the first time. Such a person, who was, so obviously and indisputably brilliant. Well, I guess Einstein was supposed to be, quirky as well, from what I vaguely know. Such a person who's self-evidently brilliant from the start, maybe they could make their way into academia while forgetting all about the game. But that's very few people, even at the most elite institutions. So for everyone short of that, you have to play the game.
Now, there are a bunch of great anecdotes in the book about a conservative scholar who starts off with tremendous enthusiasm for your work, and then the enthusiasm very quickly goes limp. And
McConnell.
Michael McConnell. That's wonderful. Tell us more about Michael McConnell.
Look, I never met him personally, though. I tried as I went in there. So, what's that?
I know you tried to meet with him, but
I tried.
He wasn't
there.
Yeah.
And he didn't tell me he wouldn't be there. So I don't know, but that's all fun and games. But no, he was he had just started the year when everything went down. That was his first year at Stanford. He was formerly a federal appellate judge, and I guess he needed a career break, so he moved into academia. I think he probably already had some involvement in academia, even as a judge, and he, after my fellowship wasn't renewed, I had to apply to other ones. One of them was the Federalist Society, which is a right of center organization. He was kind of a big shot there. He apparently dispensed, at least had some significant role in dispensing their fellowships, and I kind of suspected that he would appreciate the paper, because even though the paper that I gave to Barbara in September was kind of crappy, by the time I applied to the Federal Society, it was in much better shape. So I thought he would appreciate it, which he did, and we went back and forth, and I did everything I could to finally arrange a time to meet him, but it never worked out, even though I tried on multiple occasions. And my explanation for it is that he was apprised of the surreptitious conflict, the surreptitious gaslighting by another professor, and that's what explains the discrepancy. So that is, I make the argument that is more likely than mere chance and randomness that our correspondences became what they did, and readers will evaluate for themselves whether I've made that argument.
Now, you repeatedly describe gaslighting in your book, but you also make it appear that it had virtually zero gaslighting effect on you at the time. Now, is that you now reading back in and understanding more clearly what was happening? Or at the time, were you experiencing ill effects from the gaslighting, or at the time, did you see right through the gaslighting?
Well, so, it's, I think it's a matter of degrees, somewhere in between the two, oscillating between the two, at the end of the day, in my heart of hearts, did I believe that my inferences were fundamentally, correct? I would say, yes, but when it came to social interactions and communicating it to anybody, they're sort of, the social self takes over and the social norms take over, and somebody thinks you're crazy, so you kind of begin half believing it as well. So it's a matter of degrees that depends on context. But I recognize the tension you're highlighting it, because on the one hand, I'm describing it as gaslighting, thus suggested that I was somehow, manipulated, that somehow I had been fooled into doubting my own sanity. But on the other hand, I give indications that I know that I have not been fooled, that I know what's exactly what's going on. So there's a certain tension there, but I think that might be inherent to gaslighting. I'm not sure.
Well, I would argue that if you are in touch with yourself and have a realistic understanding of yourself, that you can't really be gaslit. Gaslighting depends upon you being open to delusional thinking. So, for example, if I have an exaggerated sense of my own importance, I'm much more vulnerable to being gaslit. To people telling me, oh, if only you did this with your show, you'd have 500 times more viewers. All right, if I'm not in touch with reality, I'd be much more, bending and twisting and turning to try to accommodate these various suggestions. While if I have an accurate understanding that I'm doing a high IQ show for which there's going to be a very narrow audience, right, then I'm not going to be gaslit. So one's susceptibility to gaslighting is primarily determined by one's own ability to live in reality. That's my thesis. What do you think?
Yeah, I certainly accept that distinction, and maybe it would have been more technically correct for me to speak of my attempted gaslighting rather than my gaslighting. But that's just it's extra words and extra syllables that maybe I didn't want in there. But I would also say that even though the distinction you've highlighted is basically valid, I think people these days, given the how prominent the term has become, people will also use gaslighting in sort of the looser sense of attempted gaslighting. So I would say, are you gaslighting me? Or to say something like that, I'm accusing you of gaslighting, but I'm also evincing my awareness of what's going on. So yeah, it's not a strict usage of the term, and it created some ambiguity and some questions. But those questions are worth exploring. And again, from a literary point of view, I just wanted to speak of gaslighting, and I felt that I needed to use that term because it's been used so loosely to address any kind of intellectual disingenuity. My experience, as I write in the frequently asked questions, actually bears some kind of resemblance to gaslighting as it was